As we now consider future investments, okay, rather than looking at historicals, we need to consider another formula. So when we're dealing with expected returns and measuring risk, we will use the expected payoff is the sum of the payoffs times the probability of that occurrence. We'll take a look at an example in just one moment. So just a reminder, when we talk about probability, we always want the probabilities to add up to 1 or 100%, and the probabilities must be positive. But let's take a look at this example here. So we have a stock, okay, and we're trying to determine the expected return of that stock. But we have to consider the different economic states, okay, so that's our probability, versus the return in that economic state. So for instance, this stock in a recession, okay, which looks like there's going to be a likelihood of a recession based off of the probability, the return in that economic state is a negative return. So if there's a recession, the stock isn't going to perform very well. If it's a steady economy, a little less likely that will happen, but you have a more better return, more likely return, or positive return. Finally, if it's a booming economy, things are going very well, then we know that we're going to have a higher return. Okay, so the question is, how do we figure out the expected return? And by accounting for all three different states, okay, so again, we take the probability of the economic state times the return of that state. So in this case, again, remember the recession, we had a 45% chance there's going to be a recession, multiplied by that rate of return in that recession. We're going to add also the steady economy. So what happens in a steady economy? Well, likely it's going to be 35%. That's the probability, and we're looking at 12% return. Finally, if it's a boom economy, which might happen 20% of the time, we get a 20% return. And that's going to give us, again, that 3.7 is the expected rate given all three considerations. And we can also determine our variance as well, okay, our standard deviation or our variance, which is also going to help us understand that the likelihood or the variance, the risk of that return. Okay, so if this was a smaller number, then we'll have smaller risk, and we can be more confident that we'll get a return of 3.7%. Now, obviously, we have to determine investments in both risk and return, okay? And we'll start to see a trade-off in just one moment, okay? But before we talk about that trade-off, remember two rules, okay? So if we have two investment choices and they both have the same returns, well, we're going to choose the one with the lower risk. If we have two investment choices that have similar risk, then we'll choose the one that has a higher expected return. Now, let's take a look at it from the point of view of our charts here. Again, if we have our risk that are equal, okay, we want to choose the investment asset that is less risky. Versus here, we want to, if we have the same level of risk, we want to take a look at the asset that's going to hopefully give us a higher expected return. And remember, we're using the word expected, okay, because we're always forecasted. So this is not a guaranteed return. Now the question might be, in this case, which is a better investment? Okay, so in both cases, well, if you look at investment S, we have a very high risk, but we also have a very high return. Versus investment L is lower risk, but lower return. So there is no mathematical best solution in this case, and it's just a matter of strategy. However, this does fall into or lead us to the concept of diversification, because ideally we want to minimize our risk, okay? And ultimately diversification just means investing in different opportunities, spreading our wealth over different investments, and we'll discuss why we do that. How does that help? Okay, but ultimately, we're trying to offset our risk by investing in different various companies, specifically low correlated assets, and we'll talk about correlation in just one moment. So here, if we take a look in terms of our two firms, we have Zig and Zag, okay? Now we invest in these two companies equally. We want to see what happens to our expected returns. Okay, so again, we're comparing that company. So we compare company Zig in a boom, steady, and a recession. Okay, so as you can see, company Zig does very well in a boom economy, does okay in a steady economy, and finally returns are okay in a recession economy. But if you look at company Zag, they do the opposite. Okay, so in a boom economy, they're not doing so well. Steady economy, they do okay. But a recession is when they're doing really, really well. So by investing in both companies equally, we can see that our returns become more stabilized. Okay, we can see that we have a 15% expected return all across the board. So this is what we mean by offsetting our risk. Okay, so we want to make sure that we're investing in highly different companies because, for instance, in company Zig, okay, when things are booming, they do really well, whereas company Zag is the opposite. So we want to find those inverse relationships that's going to help us have a well-diversified portfolio, and which is going to equal a more stable return. So in this case, we're investing equally 50-50. Okay, what does that look like? Well, ultimately, it's just a weighted average. Okay, so again, if we took the weight in Zig was 50% plus the expected return of Zig plus the weight of Zag, which is 50% times the expected return, that would give us our expected return. Many of us probably have calculated that when we're calculating our grades. Okay, so if a test is worth 20% and another exam is worth 40, we're going to take a weighted average to determine our expected grade or return. So here again, just a little more detail, okay? But don't worry too much. We will definitely do this in our Excel homework, okay? But again, we're just taking a weighted average. Just remember that the weights should always add up to 1 or 100%. Now, one thing to point out, just in terms of the theory, is to remember when we actually do the calculations, we see, we talked about a more stable expected return. So when we actually do the math here, that's 15% is more stable than these 15% because our standard deviation is actually 0. Okay, so again, that's how we minimize risk. We want to remove the standard deviation to as low as we can. So, and we mentioned this briefly, but how does it work? When does diversification work? Well, again, we have to combine stocks that aren't similar, okay? So they're not positively correlated with each other. Because remember, if in our example, return on company Zig when there was a boom economy was 25%. So we don't want to invest in the same type of stocks that do really well in a boom economy, but then don't do well in a recession, because we're not offsetting our risk. Okay, so that's why it's really important to invest in a diversified manner, so that we can minimize or offset our risks. Now, this is again more examples of that. Okay, so if we invest in perfectly positive correlated two assets, okay, so these two companies have the same returns given the different types of economies. Okay, that's not going to help us diversify. And again, now this is a different example, going back to our original example actually. Now this, we have zig and zag. What happens when we put them together? Okay, we have we've minimized our risk, okay, and we have a more stable return. So that's why it's important to have our negatively correlated. In other words, they offset each other. Now, so far, we've taken a look at adding just 2 stocks together, okay? But ultimately, a portfolio should have about 20 to 30. 30 would be probably the max, okay? So the more stocks that you have within that range, the more likely you're going to minimize your risk, okay? And we're always ultimately trying to minimize our systematic risk, okay? So this is what happens with the risk of the portfolio. The more stocks that we invest in, the lower our systematic risk goes. Our unsystematic risk. Now, systematic risk can't be eliminated, and we'll talk about that in just one moment. Well, that moment is now. So, again, unsystematic risk, okay, so that is risk that can be diversified, okay? So that's more industry or specific risk. Okay, so that might be, again, if you maybe company ZAG has certain risk with environmental risk issues. Okay, where companies. So maybe company ZAG is a oil company, and then company ZIG might be a electric company. So company ZIG might not have the same type of risk associated. Now, systematic risk is a risk that cannot really be avoided. Okay, so if there's a recession, or inflation is a good example, really hard to sort of offset inflation. Okay, so again, a well-diversified portfolio, that's one we can minimize or eliminate unsystematic risk. Okay, so that means that we have offsetting all of our stocks, and if one performs badly, the other one's going to perform well.